Okay, and today on the podcast, we have Richard Salcido and Paul Carrola. I would like to welcome them to the recording room. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, doing good.
Absolutely. So, I would really like if you all could please tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you work, who you are, maybe a fun fact. I'm not sure. Whatever you want to say.
Yeah, so I'm here. I'm Paul Carrola. I work as a associate professor in the counseling program and health counseling program here at the University of Texas, El Paso. I've been here for a little over 11 years, and my background before that, I think it's probably relevant to what we're talking about. My first clinical experience was working with court mandated clients and in a correctional setting. So the bulk of my clients were always men. And so I had a very
Oh,
specific experience dealing with that, and then a different experience when I transitioned out of that. Noticing, well, now most of my clients are not men, so it kind of changed pretty significantly. And as far as research, I'll just briefly say that we because we're here on the U.S. Mexico border, we do research in Mexico, and I've always had an interest in domestic violence and what we used to call like offender counseling, but now we just use it in different terms. People involved with criminal justice system or people have a history of violence or domestic violence, and so we did a study. We're doing a study on with men in Mexico who've been with a history of domestic violence and looking at measuring their identity, masculine identity through a cultural lens assessment, the machismo measure.
oh, interesting.
And I won't talk too much about that, but that's interesting, and so that may come up in the discussion as we're going forward.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for talking about that and letting us know about yourself. I think it's important for people to know that the three of us live on the border of Mexico and Texas in El Paso. So that provides context to what we're going to talk about. And also, I believe both of you identify as he, him, right?
Correct.
So we will move on to Richard. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, and I started with my career in certainly dating myself, but I was hired as a therapist for the abuser, the male abuser, and my career evolved from that. But of course, I was given that position because I'm a male, and they thought working with male would be better, and it worked fine. But I also found that I could work with battered women as well, and uh, and so it just evolved from there. My career has consisted of being a practitioner. I did a lot of work in the sexual abuse area where I worked with the offender, I worked with the victim, and I worked with a non-offending parent. I also then became the executive director of a counseling agency. And that'll be important too as we talk about patterns and males working in the field. And then the last, I think, 20 years, I've been heavily involved in providing supervision to developing counselors in the field.
Yes, and you were my supervisor. I always have to say that. You were my LPC supervisor. So thank you so much for introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about yourself. So I just want to provide some context for the upcoming questions. The podcast, Through the Eyes of a Therapist, is about sort of taking a peek inside of a therapist's brain or mind and what we think about. And so I recently became curious about how counseling and social work and the social service fields seem to be inundated with female or women identifying people, and it seems to be dominated by these people, women, right? And so I noticed that many of my clients over time have also been women. I've only been in the field for about 13, 14 years, but many of my clients have been women, and I've had very few men that I've come across. But I don't know if that's because I'm a woman, I identify as a woman, I appear as a cisgendered woman too. So it could be that. But kind of like Richard was saying, right, that maybe because we have a certain presentation, we're assigned certain clients, who knows, right? But I also noticed that many therapists that I've worked with over time have been women, social workers, licensed professional counselors, even some of the students that I work with. I think this is the first year that I've been teaching. I've only been teaching since like 2021. It's not like forever or anything, but just in that short amount of time, I think I've only had like 3 men identifying students, and they're all together in one class right now. So it's interesting. And before everybody was like woman identifying or they, them, right? So anyway, just to give some background about why we're talking about this, I was just curious about it. And I wanted to see if I could interview some men identifying people to talk about this. So, my first question for you is if you've noticed some of these patterns, like similar patterns of, having women dominate the workplace or the classroom or the waiting room. And can you tell us about some of these things that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it kind of, for me, of course, it I look at the students as they gone through, and I've been here, I'll say a little over, well, maybe 12 years now. I've been here, and we look at the students, and throughout that time, has been predominantly women, students who identify as women coming through the program. And when I came here, the faculty demographic was different. There was primarily men, let's say older men, who were teaching in the program, and maybe it was really no. There were times where maybe one or no uh, faculty that were identifying as women, and that's changed a lot. And we've done that to try to represent the students. We think that's important, and also just for diversity reasons. Now, I haven't, and maybe Richard can talk about this more. You can see more of a pattern, but I've seen there's been times where there's been a cohort that have come through with a chunk of men, like maybe you have had maybe one class in those 12 years where it was equal. The rest, it's
Oh,
always pretty much majority women in my classes. And as far as when we admit students, we'd get really like almost excited when there'd be like maybe 7 or 8 men out of 40 applicants or something, or 10, or maybe
oh,
having more than
okay.
10. So usually in a class, it's going to be a few less, 5 or less. And I've had classes where there was no men at all. Um, and so that's
Mm-hmm.
been the pattern. And I think it's changed. I think the reasons for that, I think, are different than they were, I think, maybe years ago. And I think um, there's a traditional reasons why men would not seek this profession, would not seek going into therapy, and I think those reasons are were historical. And I think there are reasons why men are not doing that now, but I think maybe they're different reasons. And so that's kind of what I'm seeing. We can talk about that a little bit, but I'd love to hear what Richard thinks about the students he's worked with over the years.
Yes, well, as executive director responsible for staffing the organization, and the fact has always been that there's far fewer men than women in the field. I remember attending a training recently, online training by Dr. Kate Walker, and there was 100 people in that training. I was the only male. Okay, so this
Yes.
this
Wow.
was a statewide training for LPC supervisors. I was the only male out of 100 people attending. So that tells you that it's not just in El Paso, and that it's a female-dominated field. So to me, it was always a goal to find a male therapist because there are far a few in between. So let's say, for example, out of a staff of 60 therapists, combination of students, associates, and licensed therapists, I would have maybe 2 or 3 male therapists. And so,
Interesting.
yes, and it's not that there's not a need for male therapists, but I will tell you that of clients seeking therapy, there's more of them seeking or preferring to be with a female therapist than with a male therapist. And so I would often find
Hmm.
myself assigning, say, a male therapist to a young male child. And the mother would say, no, I want a female therapist for him. Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, it's different when they're adolescents. When they're adolescents, then the parents say, "Yeah, no, I want him to be with a man." And then the same thing. Sometimes I would assign a male therapist to a female client, and the client, without knowing the therapist, without never having met him, would say, "No, I want a female therapist." And so, yeah, there's issues in assigning. As a therapist myself, I'm like soft-spoken and gentle and sensitive. And so when I was working in the battered women field, and I would be working with the victims, they were really dumbfounded that somebody would listen and would be nurturing and non-threatening and understanding. And so to
Yeah.
me, that's the importance of women being able, especially that population, being exposed to, and knowing that not all men are abusers or rough or insensitive.
Yeah, I totally understand that there's a um, clinical reason for that, right? Almost like a corrective emotional experience. So it sounds like working with this population was a healing experience for the women you worked with.
Yes.
Awesome. Something that you said sort of stood out to me about, what the preferences were for clients. And I wonder if you have a hypothesis about that. Why do you think that certain people would request women or certain people would request men?
Yes, most certainly. There's a lot of biases in terms of, what I talked about before, men being sensitive or perceived as being insensitive. There's also fear of, for example, having their young child with a male, a fear of that child being molested, perhaps, or in some way maltreated. Even in staffing, when I staff the agency, I'm also much more cautious in hiring a male. Not that I'm not going to, but I'll do a deeper background check, and because there is sort of a risk with a male individual. I used to have home visiting programs, and so again, that you have to consider that also. Yeah, so there's just a lot of perceptions. There's some stigmas, and that you have to work around.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that information. I think that the listeners who might be listening right now are either interested in therapy, go to therapy, or are becoming therapists. So I think it's good to talk about all those nuances and considerations we have to take in, like the societal perception of male therapists or just men in general with that toxic masculinity, or men as perpetrators of any type of abuse, and how that could play into a client and counselor relationship for sure. What do you think, Dr. Carrola?
Yeah, I think that bias is really, it's really embedded, and it's beneath the surface, and we have to be really aware of it, and we have to really go out of our way, and it's just the way it is, when I to be more disarming, right? To be more open and to show that we're not threatening, and even though people shouldn't have to prove that they're not threatening, but I think they're, because of that bias and history, and because of clients' history and other relationships, you're coming in, and they're going to project a lot of those things. And so you need to really be disarming, and you need to show them, demonstrate through your behavior that you're different. And I think that's highly, as Richard was saying, highly therapeutic for a client to realize that I can have a relationship with a man that is just a normal, healthy, professional relationship where I'm treated with respect, I'm listened to, and that's usually not been their past for a lot of them. And so there's a resistance there, but I think we have to balance what the client feels comfortable with also the benefits of, you know, connecting with someone that they normally wouldn't connect with, and how that can open them up to other connections in their lives. I'll say also, like, when I was working, when I did have private practice for for a short time, when I'd see female clients, I'd always make sure I left the door a little open, even though you're thinking about confidentiality. I wouldn't feel comfortable like closing the door all the way, because I'm like, it just, it feel, it I had to feel like I had to protect myself too. So there's this concern that because you're a male, you could be perceived, or even you know people could assume things about you, think you may do something, even though that's completely, there's no evidence at all for that, and you have to take those steps. So men who come into the field, I think, need to be prepared to do that, and we need to train them, and we try to do that. Sometimes men will come into the program thinking they're coming in as a military veteran. I'm going to work with other military veterans. I'm going to work with other men, people similar to me, and we really have to open them up to, no, you have to be ready to work with everybody, and that's the kind of multicultural competence that we try to have. And I think, yeah, I think that's what I was thinking when we look at the patterns of why there's not a lot of men coming in for therapy, and why there's not a lot of men coming into the profession, kind of because that bias and perception. And some men, and I'm not really sure about the men coming into therapy, if it's about not wanting to work with a female or a woman, or just more about not really wanting to come and talk about those traditional kind of things that men can be vulnerable and weak. And I'm not sure. There's definitely instances where they may relate better to a man, but there's also instances where they may feel comfortable talking to a woman about them. So I'm not really clear on how that dynamic really explains men's willingness to come in.
Yeah, it makes me think of kind of like the other part of this that I was curious about is men attending therapy. So there's you all as clinicians and teachers and supervisors and mentors, being men and noticing patterns in that way, but also, um, what about men coming into therapy and seeing you as a therapist? I really am curious about what the dynamic is like for like a male or man identifying therapist with another man identifying person in a room, because obviously I have no experience with that. I identify as a woman and I understand sort of the dynamic of having a male identifying person or a they them or like a woman, but that's closed doors. Like I don't know what it's like for a man to counsel another man. Like is there a specific uh like thing?
Yeah. Crystal, I don't know if you remember when we were at family service. One of the things I would teach is that we have three kinds of clients that come, and one is the visitor, somebody that has to be there. The other one's the complainant, somebody that's there to complain about somebody else, and the other one is a client, the one that's there for meaningful change. Well, men are usually what we call visitors. Many of them are there because they've been mandated. Either their wife saying, you better go or I'll leave you, or maybe they're on probation and the probation officer sends them, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not always there voluntarily.
Oh,
Okay.
interesting.
So
Hmm.
some of the dynamic has to be in engaging them and seeing that there's something in it for them, how they can benefit from the therapy. So you get more men in that category than them going voluntarily saying, I need help.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about their gender or their, I mean, it is. There's a pattern
Right.
there that most of them
Yes.
are mandated, but the way that you would engage them clinically is by conceptualizing if they are visitors or if they're clients or
Yes.
what are they there for?
Right. And what I teach is, when you have a visitor in front of you, you put all your energy into making them clients. And so that's the engagement process. And for them to be able to see, I can benefit from this. Even though I have to be here, I can benefit from this.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
think that's really central to what our work with all clients, right? Getting them that's to that stages of change model, where if they're not ready, if they have to be there, right, they're mandated to be there by the court system, and you need to build rapport. You need to try to present this as an opportunity for them to have some, so it's going to be beneficial for them. And the work is like we do, motivational interviewing and things like that. But I also think when you're talking about this, what do men talk about in therapy if they're two? There's a male therapist, a man therapist, and a man or male client. And I think, it's hard for me to think like how it could be different, but I do because obviously we are all human and we all have these issues we need to talk about. And ideally, theoretically, we know that if you do the same things, if you build rapport and you build strong therapeutic working alliance, that the client's going to respond well to that, whether they're a man or woman, whether you're a man or woman. But I think there are some instances where, if I was a client and I was having relationship issues with my wife and I have a female therapist, maybe I'm not going to say certain things that may seem to be judgmental. Um, and maybe if I had a male therapist, I would maybe say, well, like I don't like this or I don't like that, and I may feel safer saying that in those instances. And so I think there are certain times when a man could feel more comfortable talking about certain issues with another man. Um, but as I said before, I think there's also that dynamic where I've seen men who don't like male therapists, right? They feel more comfortable talking to a woman because they're going to be vulnerable and they don't want another man to see them vulnerable. They
Oh,
feel
interesting.
that they project the motherly kind of role onto the therapist, and they feel more comfortable when it's a woman. They perceive her as being more nurturing, less judgmental, and so I think that happens in both ways. But yeah, for sure there are going to be, I think, some men who come in, and once they do become invested in change and doing something, they may feel more open talking about certain issues. Of course, depends on the issue that they're working through. If it's relationship issues, I think there's benefits on both sides, right? Because you can get different perspectives. And that's why I think, a great thing is having co-facilitated um, sessions. With if you have groups or couples, having a male and a female therapist is really great when that's able to happen. It's not always able to happen, but when you can do that, I think that's great.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that option, but that makes sense. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you would recommend maybe like co-facilitating?
Mhm. Yeah, I think in general, you get number one, you get two therapists, so you get two perspectives, and you need to prepare
Mhm.
for that. Like anything else, you make sure there's preparation, so you're both on the same page. But you have different perspectives, and if those two therapists work well together in supplementing each other and not trying to like push things in different directions, right? If they're able to work well together, the client benefits from both perspectives. And when you have um, either a female client or a male client who maybe has issues with the other gender, they can see that collaboration and they can get feedback from both. So if they feel a little bit maybe not threatened, but a little bit like insecure about talking with one person about something, the other person is there to kind of buffer that and make them feel a little bit more, secure, safe about that. So I think, yeah, I mean, in general, I think it's great to do that. Couples therapy, I think having co-facilitators is like great. It's awesome because couples therapy can be very challenging, right? And so I think, but and the reality is we can't always do that because of many different reasons. Um, but yeah, a lot of different dynamics provide having different gender identities, different perspectives really enriches the therapeutic process, I think.
Yeah, and it also makes me think, your comments are making me think about how we see gender and sex as like two polar opposites. And I think now we're starting to understand a little bit more that there's like a spectrum, right? So it'd be interesting to have people who identify as they, them, or who are androgynous presenting or something, right? Talk about their experiences with different presentations, but it would be kind of like a really long podcast or like a series or something, right? Because we'd have to get all kinds of different people talking about it. But I think that it's really neat to hear just like I guess my quote unquote opposite perspective, right? From like men talking about this because um yeah, just the patterns that I've noticed. And then also uh hearing the similarities in the way we might work with an individual, no matter how they present or how they identify. It
Right.
kind of makes me think of the next question I want to ask you is what it's like to be a cisgendered presenting man. Um, in a woman dominated field, like just on the day to day, right? I know you talked earlier about like safety with clients, recruiting and like retaining trainees or students or staff. But just interpersonally, I guess, what is it sort of like for you to be a man in this field?
Well, I did it for a lifetime. I was 24 when I entered the field, and I'm 70 now. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
to me, I've got great comfort level in it. I was raised by women, very nurturing women, and so to me, it was comfort. There's a religious saying, "Bendito seas tú entre todas las mujeres," and
Oh my
so
gosh. I didn't
it's
even think of that. But
I
yeah,
would,
that's true.
yes, I would. When people would see me at lunch with a group of women, they would, I would say that joke, or that saying, not a joke. So to me, it was normal. It was normal. It's something that I adapted to and I enjoyed. And of course, not that I didn't miss the male camaraderie, but I would have to find it some other ways.
Got it. Yeah, and I guess just to translate for people who don't speak Spanish, that means blessed are you among women, right? Kind of
Yes,
thing.
yes, yes,
Interesting. Yeah, that's
yeah.
funny.
I think my experience was a little bit different in that I, grew up, my young adulthood up until my 30s, I guess, which is maybe not that older than what Richard was when he entered the field. When we talk about the grand, when we look back on it now, but that really formed a lot of my uh, views about masculinity, and I had very traditional views, and in some ways I still do, but I think being around, I was around men in some cases just hyper masculine kind of environments for most of my young adult life. And so transitioning into the profession when I was in my 30s um, was different for me. And I found it actually that it was much more, for example, when I look at my work environment and, my boss or my supervisor, um, when they're, when I found when they were women, those who identified as women, I felt they were much easier to work with. And I didn't want to stereotype, I didn't want to be, um, men are competitive and women are wanting to cooperate, but they would listen to me more. They would take time and say, "How are you doing? How can I support you?" And sometimes, yeah, traditionally when I had male supervisors or um, bosses, I guess when before I entered the profession, it was just very authoritarian, pretty much. And that's
That's
because
an
the
interesting
fields,
pattern.
the environments I was working or I was at. So I found it very comfortable, and I really adapted. I think I adapted well to it, and I learned to kind of, adjust my views of masculinity because they were very immature at a certain, in my young adulthood. I think they were very immature, very just based on the normal things I was raised with or I would kind of see. And so it's about proving yourself and being strong and all those kind of things. And so I learned the value of not always being that way. And so it's been interesting for me. I really enjoyed it. I don't think I struggled with adapting to it because when I saw that it was different and I saw the relationships I had with them were different, I really liked it. And in the male bonding part, I was always had no problem with that because, as Richard said, there's always outlets for that, and I always had ways to do that through sports or exercising and different groups. There was always that male camaraderie, and I think that's an important thing to talk about, which may be a different podcast, maybe, but I think, yeah, the transition in the profession, I think it's good for more men to be in the profession. So it feels, I think what we need to do is dispel some of those biases. And I think the more men that are in the profession are going to help do that.
Yeah, it makes me think of how we can encourage either men to become therapists or social workers or um, to join us in the field, right? And do you think that there's anything specific that we can do as far as having more male therapists around or men identifying therapists around?
I think we do recruit, or we try to recruit, and I think it's a long, the profession has done really a good job in a lot of ways about reducing the stigma of mental illness, right? As we all know that 20 years ago was very different. The past 20 years, been working really hard to reduce the stigma through a lot of outreach and a lot of different just media communications, the way we advocate. And so more people are coming in, right? And I think there are more men coming in. It's just kind of not at the rate that we would really like to see. It's been overwhelmingly, out of all the people that are coming in, it's still majority women who are coming in to the profession and to therapy. And so I think they're paralleling each other. Um, and many of the reasons people come in to the profession, as Richard will probably will know this too, that if they had some issue themselves, right? They had an issue that they dealt with, and so now they want to come into the profession because that therapeutic experience really changed them and it made a big impact on them. So they want to come in, and that's what they want to do. And so women are still more likely to have those experiences. They're still more likely to go into therapy, and so have that experience and then want to actually be part of the profession. Men are doing it too, but it's much lower rate, I think. With after these big changes that happened after the Iraq War and Afghanistan wars, that a lot of men were coming into therapy, and I think what I've noticed, and this is just anecdotal, just what I think, that they would come in, they'd have some kind of therapeutic experience. A lot of them didn't like it, right? They didn't like it, but the ones that did like it and have a benefit, they'd come in, but they wanted to work with just people like themselves. They wanted to work with military veterans, and they wanted to, because that's what they felt they could relate to. And I think when they come into the profession and they see, no, we're going to talk about working with children and play therapy and all these other things, they get kind of like they feel like they can't relate to that. So I think, you know, we need to, the reality is that when you come into the profession, you have to be willing to work with everybody. And I feel
Yeah.
strongly about that. And I don't want us to change and say, okay, you're men coming in, we're going to train you just to work with this specific male population. But I think we do need to really somehow make that seem more palatable to them. Make that seem like, you know what, yeah, you don't, maybe you've been in you've been in a hyper masculine environment most of your life. But you know what? You can work with kids if you really, you could do that. You could work
Hmm.
with women. You could be that listening ear for them. And I think we just need to make that more palatable for them. And it's going to take time.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
If I can add, there's just a lot to this. If we look at historically, men took jobs on as firemen, policemen, construction people, etc., male-dominated professions that have been slowly infiltrated by women lately.
Hmm.
And but we were brought up that these are the fields that are available to you that you go into, and a lot of those require strength. They require dominance. They require more of the male trait. And so that's how we've been programmed, and it takes a lifetime to change that. And so there's been little changes. And so, can we develop more therapists? Can we recruit more males to come into the field? I think it's going to be a slow process. I also think of economics. Okay, like in Mexico, the social work profession is 100% female. Why? Because they make less money, and men are supposed to make more money. Okay, yes. And so, how much of that is true in the United States? And so, is there more money to be made by men doing other professions versus going into the counseling field? And so, yeah, it's just so broad what's going on.
Yeah, I understand that it was like a loaded question, right? Because
Yeah,
there's so many systemic factors, like sociological
Mhm.
factors,
yeah,
the way that men are raised, like you were saying, in hyper masculine environments, and the messages
Yeah.
with toxic masculinity starting from like when kids are babies, right? We buy
Yeah.
them blue and pink,
Right.
and it's
Yeah.
like it's
It,
a lifetime of messages to maybe undo, is what I'm hearing.
yes. You buy them guns or dolls. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is so much to say about it, and I think these messages that we send about gender differences, it's societal, and we're still reinforcing them, even though they're changing. We still reinforce them, and I think there's been a lot of progress, but we've also taken kind of some steps back in certain areas, and I think you know certain messaging because of social media and different things and all, just like political type of environment, that certain certain messaging that we would say is not okay anymore is now being like kind of okay again, and so these kind of groups are developing through because they can do it online, and they reinforce each other, and it becomes very toxic. That toxic masculinity becomes very like people just gravitate to it, and it becomes they feel validated by it for different reasons, and so there's a lot of work to do, and I think, as Richard said, it's
Hmm.
it's it's changing, but it's very slow, and I don't think it's realistic for us to think that we're going to just all of a sudden have all these men in the profession. But we do need to kind of see what we can do, and try to address the issues that we can address. And I don't know, other than what I said earlier about trying to kind of, you know, make this more, make this not so much about this profession is not about, you know, the qualities to be a therapist are not female qualities or woman that you'd attribute to a woman. There
Hmm.
are humanistic qualities, and I think embracing that broader humanistic perspective is um, that's the way we need to go. But that's difficult because that people don't think that a lot of people don't think that way, and you have to kind of like bring that up to that. You have to kind of send those messages out and just reinforce it. But yeah, I think a lot. I could talk a lot about toxic masculinity. I know that's a different kind of maybe a different issue there, but I think a lot of things generationally are different now than they were then, and challenges why I think there's some toxic masculinity happening there. It's different than it was before.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes me think of like the whole idea of recruiting girls for STEM, right? And how those types of careers were dominated by men, or still are, and how they're going into schools like teaching how STEM skills like math and science and those things are not gendered or not like assigned by sex or something. Like you can learn to be a doctor, a computer scientist, even if you're a woman or female or non-binary or whatever, right? So like degendering some of these things I think could be helpful, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that I haven't thought of it as I never thought of it as a gendered profession, but I can think the traits that people think about tend to be traits we think of as nurturing, right? But they're really just humanistic traits. But
Mm-hmm.
we think in binary terms usually, because it's easier. That's the easier way for us to think about, and the
Right.
economics that Richard brought up too about like that you have to do this, you have to make the society's telling you, or you want to make more money, then you need to do this, and so if you want to make more money, um, then why are you going to go into that profession? Um, but I was going to say one thing about before I forget about the generational changes that I still struggle to kind of relate to the way the young generation is experiencing things. Um, I had a very traditional experience of what masculinity meant or what being a man meant to me, right? And now it's very different, and I kind of try to adapt, but I don't really. I think the younger generation is facing a lot of uncertainty of young boys who are trying to be men. I think they're struggling with different things, and I think that's an issue that we do need to address in counseling, um,
Mm-hmm.
because they're getting a lot of messaging, right? A lot of messaging. Some of it is a lot of it is good through mainstream, positive things, but a lot of it is very toxic. And they're when they're at that age where they're trying to find themselves, they're easily drawn to these kind of toxic uh, messaging because it can feel very empowering, right? It makes you feel strong. Um, but I think that's leading to a lot of other negative things in our society, and I think that's something that we need to address, and we need to reach out to that population somehow.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that intervening kind of like early in people's lives, but also in like a wider systems sort of way. It's interesting because the other thing I thought about while you were talking was how many of the theories that we learn in counseling were like coined by men, like
Hmm.
older white guys.
Hmm.
And but most of the students are women. So that's interesting, right? But it makes me think of like how there's power dynamics and how um over time, like you're talking about generations, right? Like like women maybe wouldn't work outside of the home or um didn't have opportunities that were the same or equal to men. So it's just interesting that a lot of the founding like theories are the ones that we teach are um yeah, like created by men or like grouped together and named by men, right?
Hmm.
I don't know if anybody has anything to say about that, but it was an interesting observation as I thought about like generations and
Well,
how things
yeah,
have evolved.
I think from a meta perspective, you look at changes that have happened over the years, and people being in a very privileged position, right, in different groups, right, but gender is one of them, a big one. And then when that starts to shift, you feel that there's a natural insecurity with the group that used to be in that position of high privilege. And so dealing with that is something that needs to be, you know, addressed, I think. And so, people, the profession, you know, having its foundations and, you know, pretty much whether you're talking about, and they may be different, but I think especially psychology, but, counseling and social work as well to a certain degree, having this dominated by a certain group, and then that's really, really, really changed. And so there's been a lot of, you know, that how do we really how do we change how do we address these kind of changes, and how is that impacting the services that we're providing, and how does that really um, like I think it's in some ways it's appropriate for the changes to happen the way that they have, right? For more women to be in the profession, for more women to be in certain positions, leadership positions. But overall, how do we address the issue that there's this becoming maybe it's becoming, like you were saying, a gendered profession? Because I don't know, I never thought of that before, being a gendered profession. I don't know what it was, and Richard can maybe talk about this. Maybe 30 years ago, was it still always? I mean, you mentioned before, like there was always women dominating the profession, but at some point, maybe it was different. I don't know, and so it seems like I don't know how recent that is that it's kind of being perceived as a gendered profession.
I think it's pretty much how it's been. I think it's always been the majority.
Yeah, it makes me think of like teaching too, right?
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
teaching, more like human service sort of
Yes.
professions tend to be or tend to have a lot of females or women in them. But I
Mm.
think it's because of like kind of what you talked about, like the characteristics, they're kind of grouped together, even though they are not gendered skills alone, right? But if it's kind of like women tend to have a lot of those characteristics or have been socialized to have them. I don't know if it's like an innate thing, but that's another part. Geez, we're gonna
Yeah.
have to do like 3 more episodes of
Yeah,
this. Um, are there any like final thoughts that you have about maybe men coming to therapy? Like if there's any men listening out there or anything like that, that are interested in or considering coming to therapy, or just generally having more clients as men.
yeah. I think one of the things that I learned early was I worked with men exclusively pretty much early in my career. And I think we talk about the idea of masculinity a lot. And I think that's important to talk about that because of course, there is no definition of it, right? There's certain instruments and measures that try to measure traits, but I think
Mhm.
a lot of people look at it as your behaviors, what you do. What you do makes you a man in a lot of people's mind, a lot of men's mind. I think what's important to understand about that is that makes it a very fluid kind of identity, right? That if I do something today, that proves that I'm a man. But if I do something different tomorrow, then maybe I lose a little bit of that identity, right? So I think that's a source of a lot of insecurity and source of a lot of aggression, over aggression, hyper masculinity, hyper masculine behaviors. Is trying if when it's perceived as something that I have to prove, then you're always going to be on edge because you might lose it, right? And so I think that's something that I think the work with working with understanding that concept I think is important, and then not always results in violence or aggression. It can result in just insecurity, depression, and a lot of negative self-doubt. um, and so I think talking about that openly, and for therapists who don't identify as men, who don't really identify as uh, masculine or anything. I think understanding that concept. So I think it's a little bit different than someone who identifies as a woman, how they would conceptualize their identity. In the past, and it's changing, of course, but there's still large groups of men who identify with that masculine identity of I have to prove myself. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good, right?
Yeah, and I also wonder about if it's more for men who are of like Mexican or Latine descent, right? Just because of the concept of machismo, and like I know it complicates it. We can do that separately as another podcast, but it makes me think of that too, right? Specifically the populations we work with or the counselors that we
Absolutely.
see.
Yeah. As we speak, that my entire career has been in the nonprofit world, and my agency catered its services to the less fortunate. And so the population that I'm experienced with has been more the Hispanic population, lower income, and they have different needs and different wants. And so when you were talking about how do we encourage men to come to therapy, I think what we need to look at is why do people in general go to therapy? And so, as I said earlier, most of the men that come to therapy at family service were mandated. They had to go, uh, not just by the court systems, but sometimes by their family, saying you're out of control. You're taking too many risks, or you're drinking too much, or whatever. And so again, they weren't going willingly. Okay, but I would like to look at okay, those men that do go willingly, why do they go? What are they seeking? And I think that might help us target and understand getting the broader spectrum of men coming into therapy.
That's a smart approach, right? I think, and I wonder if there's research out there. I'm not, currently looking at any of that right now, but I'm sure
Hmm.
that somebody has to be studying this
Yeah, yeah,
stuff,
yes.
Yeah,
right?
I mean there are there's a men's mental health group that I mentioned to you before. And there's a lot of people doing. I'm doing like a little research on like machismo a little bit, but there's people doing. They're really heavily invested in doing this kind of research, and I can kind of connect you with some of those. But I think it's an emerging field, um, and it's one of the many things we need to address as a mental health profession. So sometimes it doesn't get the attention that maybe we think it should get, but there's definitely people that are focused and very passionate about
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I think that it is important and it's interesting that it's an emerging field, right? Because it's like maybe it's a newer trend or like somebody is noticing the patterns too. But I really appreciate that the both of you were able to talk to me about, um, research and patterns, but also your own personal experiences and that you were willing to do that for the public. I really appreciate that. I think sometimes it can be hard to talk about things openly um, in a public forum. So I truly appreciate your insights and your vulnerability with me today. Um, I'm also wondering if you'd like to give any information about where people can find you or if they want to ask you questions. I can definitely route them to my Instagram, which is at Through the Eyes of a Therapist. But if you have any final messages or things that you want to say, plus where we can find you.
My email address is richard_Salcido at outlook.com, and I'd be willing to answer any questions through my email.
And my email is pacarrola@utep.edu. If you just Google Paul Carrola UTEP, you'll find me. If you're interested in any kind of research on the U.S. Mexico border, if you're a researcher, if you're looking to come into the mental health profession and you're interested in our program, if you're a male and you're interested in coming in about you want to be a therapist and be a part of the profession, but you have some questions about that, maybe you're not sure about it, please reach out. You can reach out to me and love to talk to you. If you're interested in any mental health issues, um, dealing with U.S. Mexico border with men's mental health, which or any other things, if you really want, you can just email me, and I'll be happy to respond.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. And until next time, thank you.
It was a
Thank
pleasure,
Bye.
you.
Crystal. Thank you. Goodbye.